My name is Susan Stamler, and I'm the Executive Director of United Neighborhood Houses. UNH is a policy and social change organization representing 44 settlement houses in New York, and we work to inform policy decisions that strengthen our communities. I'd like to welcome you today to our R.E.A.L talk focused on education equity. Before we get started, let me just go over some housekeeping updates. One is that we have closed caption available for today's event. Please click the closed caption at the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitle. Should you have any problems with today's technology, please put your question in the Q&A and someone will contact you with assistance. We hope also that you share your insights and feedback with us, and a survey will be posted at the end of this morning's conversation in a link located in the chat. This past summer, as New York City faced health, racial, and an economic crisis, UNH, Citizens Committee for Children, and the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies joined together to articulate how racial disparities continue to impact life in New York City. We sought to explore how to rebuild our city to achieve fairness and equity for all as we work to address and dismantle the structural and institutional barriers that have disproportionately kept people of color, immigrants, and low-income New Yorkers living in or near poverty. We defined pillars of equity and the policy changes needed to lead us toward economic security and well-being. Together, we created the Racial Equity Advancement Labs, R.E.A.L, a 5-part panel series to bring experts together to discuss how systemic racism impacts our city and what we must do to eliminate those systemic inequities. This month, our sessions explored issues of economic equity, housing equity, and health equity. Today, in the 4th part of our series, we are discussing how systemic racism impacts our early childhood education and youth development systems with a focus on children from birth through school age. This morning, we will discuss the supports that are needed for children and families before the classroom, around the classroom, as well as outside of the classroom to achieve academic success. Let me give you a few facts. New York City's public schools still remain racially segregated. 2/3 of Black and Hispanic students attend predominantly Black or Hispanic schools. Only 27% of New York City schools are even representative of their school district demographics, with those schools tending to be in Central Brooklyn and the South Bronx. And according to the New York State Education Department, 58% of New York City school teachers are white, even though 80% of the student body is of color. The racial achievement gap is interconnected with systemic inequity. Black and brown students from families with low incomes are more likely to be below proficiency standards. For example, in 2018, there was a 32 percentage point gap in math and reading scores between white 4th graders and Black 4th graders in New York City. In today's session, we're going to explore with our distinguished panel how we got here and the steps needed to begin to address deep educational disparities across our city. I will briefly introduce our speakers. Given our very tight schedule for this morning, we will place their bios in the chat. Each panelist will share an opening comment, and then we'll have the opportunity for some conversation. Should you have any questions throughout the discussion, again, please share those using the Q&A function in your screen. This morning, I am joined by Takiema Bunche Smith, the Executive Director of Bank Street Center on Culture, Race, and Equity. Takiema has worked for over 2 decades to support children, families, educational programs, and systems through her work as a teacher, teacher educator, curriculum director, parent activist, and executive leader. Michelle Paige is the Associate Executive Director for University Settlement's Early Childhood Division. Michelle began her career 25 years ago as a public school teacher, and now she focuses on developing and overseeing high-quality early childhood programs for children and families. And Anne Williams-Isom was recently appointed to the James R. Dumpson Chair in Child Welfare Studies at Fordham's Graduate School of Social Services. Anne has dedicated herself to improving the lives of vulnerable children, and most recently ran Harlem Children's Zone, and prior to that, spent 13 years working at New York City's Administration for Children's Services. We have a wonderful panel. I'm excited for our conversation. Off to our program. Good morning, panelists. I will begin by asking each of you to identify and explain the barriers embedded in our early childhood and education system and youth development systems, and leave it to you to take it from there. Takiema, over to you. By the way, Takiema's references that she will be discussing will be found, links to those references will be found in the chat. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Susan. Good morning. I did the first thing. You would think after 8 months I would start talking and not be muted, but here we are. It's been 8 months of talking to screens and trying to imagine the energy of people behind those screens, which is very, very real. So thank you so much for convening this talk and this series. It's really, really powerful. And I have a very short amount of time to try to get through some very heavy concepts and some really important things that I want to just kind of give us a framing. So first, I just want to start by letting everyone know that my pronouns that I prefer to be addressed by are she and her. And I'm just really, really excited about this conversation. So what I'm going to hope is that we can just see the next few minutes that I'm speaking about as a snapshot, right? Imagine when we think about educational equity, we're not talking about just today, we're thinking about the entire history of our country, right? We can't not look back. And so let's imagine it's March 1st, 2020, right? Educational equity. So I'm going to share a few statistics and a few things to help ground our conversation. But please know, I'm not going to refer to all the pieces of inequity because we would literally be here for hours and days and probably years. So I'm going to refer to some statistics, and there'll be some links that get dropped into the chat as I'm speaking, where you can please go ahead and look at those. There's a lot to read. There's a lot of work. It'll never be done, to be quite frank. And so first, I just wanted to ground us in how we define equity, the definition that aligns with our work at the Center on Culture, Race, and Equity. And really, it's just thinking about the fact that there are racially predictable disproportionality of student engagement when it comes to education. We could also apply this term outside of education. It's racially predictable. We live in a society where white students, white children experience the highest levels of achievement in school in every measure, and Black students experience the lowest. Students that are Asian, Pacific Islander, and Latinx and Indigenous fall within the hierarchy to different degrees, but it's very predictable. And it's because of a society that has created that phenomenon. So one thing that I'm starting to move away from is the use of the term achievement gap. I'm really inspired by Gloria Latson-Billings and many others that have been talking about the fact that the idea of an achievement gap really focuses on the students that have experienced all of this inequity to create the so-called disparity, the so-called gap. Really, it's a debt that's owed to children, right? There's historic, economic, socio-political, and moral decisions and policies that our society has maintained over and over and over again that creates a lacking for people to be able to achieve their highest potential. And so we really need to start to shift the focus on not, those that are experiencing the challenges, but really the conditions and the people that create the conditions for these challenges. So it's really important for us to just kind of like reimagine and reconfigure that. And I do believe there's a link to Gloria Latson-Billings' 2006 address in the chat there. So the first place that we want to start with when we think about education, right? You have to have children to educate. And so when we talk about disparities, this is really, really important that we focus on the fact that Black women and Latina women, particularly in New York City, Puerto Rican women, and Asian Pacific Islander women actually have pregnancy-related complications, including death, at much higher rates than white women. And then when it comes to babies living to the end of their first year of life, we see a tremendous disparity again. It's again, racially predictable, right? So if you look at this chart, you'll see that Black babies excuse me, I have so many graphs that I'm trying to go through it so quickly, but Black infants die at a very high rate as compared to 6 times as high, I believe, as white babies. So this is terrible. It's unfortunate. These are 2 women who died in Brooklyn, one a year ago, Shamoni, and Sha'asia just died a few months ago during pregnancy. And so all of this impacts children's education, right? The entire family, the community, health, all of these things, right? And babies go into childcare programs holding these scars, this pain, and families have to, try to live our lives with this trauma. So we get into schools, and as Susan mentioned, we have highly segregated schools in New York City. There are lots of reports, again, one will be dropped into the chat for people to look really closely at segregation, but just really being clear that it is segregated and unequal. And it starts with, from healthcare to housing, to the educational experiences, to the types of curriculum and activities that children have access to look different in schools that are predominantly Black and brown and lower income, and white and middle class schools. And so we've got to really be really intentional when we think about what are the negative impacts of segregation. They are far reaching. We also have policing in schools that happen at different and disproportionate rates according to the racial breakdown of students. When I was preparing for this talk, 2 days ago or 3 days ago on the 18th, a memory popped up for me on Facebook, and it was reminding me that in my child's first month of high school, he had the experience of his first metal detector walking through in school, and how he called me and how stressed out he was. He didn't know what to think. He hadn't had that happen before. He got pulled out for extra monitoring, which meant he was, his waistband was checked, his shirt was pulled up, his feet were looked at, and he was made to feel like a criminal, being 6'1" and 14 years old. And so, right, there was a lot that happened. I was really upset. It upset me that day for obvious reasons. But that was October, and actually it happened every single time. Every single time metal detectors came up. And when I asked him who's on this line, what are the racial breakdown, he said, we're all Black and Latino, and there's one girl. And so this is something that happens in high school, but guess what? We have things that lead us to policing and the criminal justice system begin with things like suspension. And so this is from 2017 data in New York City, right? And the key is on the left. I made it hopefully very big so people could see. But the first graph shows just the racial breakdown of students in New York City public schools, right? So 16%. Actually, I think that's wrong. This is important. The green band is the white students, excuse me. I think I might have made a mistake. But at any rate, it's proportionally, right? Black and Latinx students make up the majority of students in New York City public schools. And when you look at suspensions, they make up 26% for Black students, 47% of suspensions, right? 40% for Latinx are the same. And then there's an underrepresentation of other races. And so we've got to really think about what is happening here. The thing that people might not know is that preschool suspensions are actually a thing as well. And so across the whole United States, Black preschool boys are 3.6 times more likely to be suspended as white children. So preschool, 3 and 4 years old. And Black girls within the larger educational system are 6 times as likely to be suspended as white girls. And so one thing that people, again, might not realize is that suspensions lead children to be on a preschool to prison pipeline. Every suspension or exclusion that happens to a child increases their risk of coming into contact with the criminal justice system. So this racial disproportionality that happens in education has a far-reaching effect on our lives, right? So this was actually, just to remind us, pre-March, pre-COVID, right? So then we move into the new world that we're living in. And so when we have a society that has created that is so steeped in racism, anti-Black racism, patriarchy, anti-poor practices, practices that don't support students that are English language learners and immigrants and LGBTQ and gender nonconforming, we move into a remote space, we move into a pandemic, and what happens is these systems and practices get replicated in the remote space. And so these are just a few things that are happening, right? There are many, many more things that are happening, but all the data that we have just shows that the disparities are continuing and in many cases actually widening. It's something for us to really think about, that students are actually being suspended from Zoom. And for the virtual classroom rules, I'd just like you all to think for yourselves as a person who is maybe working right now. How would you feel if you were told that you had to act like you're in your office and sit in one spot and don't eat or drink, right? Just think about that as an adult and think about a child that's 3 or 4 or 7 or 10 or even 15 during a global pandemic. Again, that has disproportionately impacted students of color. So it's very depressing, I know. And so I wanted to really make sure that we could just very, very briefly think about what are some things that are working? And there are many things that are working right now. Again, these things were working before the pandemic. And so that's really, really critical to think about what is the inheritance that we have right now. So
And
just
thank you. Maybe Takiema, we could get back to that after we have some of the openings. That'd be great.
Sure. Okay, great. Yep. Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Okay, that's terrific.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle. We can't hear you.
Once again, just like Takiema said, 8 months later, I'm going to get a t-shirt that says you're on mute and just take it from there. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. It's really exciting to be here. Thank you for setting up all of that context, Takiema. It's really important to understand the framework in which we're talking about. I want to also go back a little bit and talk about early childhood in particular, as it sits in the largest public school system in the country at this point. The DOE has approximately 1.2 million students in their system. About 13% of those children are English language learners. We have about 20% of the children identified or have been identified as having special needs. And about 72% of the whole student population is either receiving free or reduced lunch. Approximately 40% of the students are Hispanic, 25% are Black, 16% are Asian, and 15% are white. That is the percentage breakdown of the whole system. When we think about early childhood, we have to remember what age group we're talking about. Early childhood and early childhood education are children birth through 2nd grade. So DOE and public schools across the country have already been involved with early childhood because it does cover up to 2nd grade. For our system, we have approximately 325,000 children that have been registered in 3K for all, UPK, 1st and 2nd grade. What that doesn't capture are the younger children of the early childhood spectrum, and that is the children, the infants and toddlers. And when we think about early childhood, we have so many different labels and names that we use interchangeably. And some of those things are early Head Start, childcare, daycare, UPK, family childcare, both formal and informal. So if you add all of those children, you're looking at upwards of close to 400,000 children that would fit into the classification of early childhood education. One of the things I wanted to bring up in this morning's intro part of the discussion is just that vocabulary that we use are identifiers of different programs, but those identifications are also connected to income. Many of the programs that I just listed the children and families are eligible for those programs for participation based on their income. And what happens when you have that conversation, not considering the tenets and the philosophies of the programs themselves, but just referring to children based on their income, creates a dynamic of implicit and explicit bias. If we still refer to our children as child care eligible, Head Start eligible, you're identifying their children based on their income. What we need to do is start reframing that conversation and thinking about public education for early childhood, not based on their income, but based on the opportunities that would be afforded to everyone. Susan and Takiema both mentioned the segregation of the New York City public school system, and part of that segregation is not just ethnic breakdown, but social economic breakdown. And if we continue to have children only have access to opportunities based on their income, the segregation will stay in place and become even deeper seated. I want you to imagine, if you can, the way our school system is currently structured. If you are a child care eligible, which is a city subsidy child care eligible program, if there are not enough of those child care subsidy seats in your community, you have to go outside and look for different places. You are being denied access to an educational opportunity based on your income. Imagine a fifth grader being registered in a school, qualifies for free lunch, and the school says, well, we don't have any more space for children with free lunch. You have to find someplace else to go to school. And that's essentially what's happening in early childhood, not just in New York City, but any municipality that has income requirements for children to attend any kind of program. What I would like to offer later on in this conversation are things that we need to discuss about not only diversity and equity, but also rethinking inclusion and rethinking opportunities. In this crisis, we have to remember that this is not business as usual. Even though schools have reopened, we are in the midst of a pandemic. The pandemic has not gone away. We should not function as if this is something of the past just because schools are reopening. We are in the middle of a crisis. We are in the middle of racial strife comparable to those that we've seen in the 60s and the 50s. And we can't extract those components away from the education system. A lot of chatter and talk and press points for politicians in the past few months we have to open schools so people go back to work. And that creates a false narrative of what schools are. We cannot take away education and the economic recovery connection. Those are very embedded. But when the narrative continues to be, we have to open schools so people go back to work, then the next part of that conversation is, well, what are you doing to set that up for success? If education is part of the economic recovery, on the front end of that conversation, those compensations have to be commensurate with the importance that the education system has on the recovery of the US economy. So I'll stop there because I know we have a lot of questions and answers that we want to dive into later, and I'll send it over to Anne now.
Oh my goodness, I can't wait. I'm gonna talk really quick because I have so much to say, and I am so pleased to be on this panel with you beautiful sisters and for us to talk about something that really matters to us. So I'm just gonna really quickly say something. I have something radical to say. How about we give kids everything that they need for as long as they need it? How about that? And how about we stop doing things for children that we wouldn't do for our own children? So you guys know I have dedicated over 20 years, all of us, right? Even though we look so young, we've been in this game for a minute. And what I know for sure is that when I think about the Harlem Children's Zone, and it's not about the name, it's the concept of comprehensive services in a community, place-based for children and families and their parents that live there. I think that is what we should be focused on, because all that we kind of even put on schools, we know that schools can't do that, Suppose we really gave children what they needed, surrounded by adults who loved and cared for them, that could happen from the time when they were in their mommy's belly and we were educating and working with parents to really figure out what prenatal looks like. Takiema, when you were talking, we had a young woman, one of our after-school workers, who died, I guess she was 8 months pregnant and died. We're like, why? That's crazy. I think about what we have been able to do in connection when you're working with parents. So I think about two different stories. We had a second grader when we went to this remote world who wasn't logging on. And for me, I get nervous about that, not because I'm like, a second grader needs to be logging on, but I'm like, what's happening with that family, and is everything good? And what we found out was that mom was COVID positive. The kids were at grandma's house. We had no idea. Grandma didn't have any access to, computers, needed Pampers because there was a baby that was in the household too. Mom had to go stay someplace else. Grandma was nervous because she needed healthcare. She didn't want to get COVID. So eventually mom and the kids had to go into a shelter. She goes and tries to get into a shelter and they're like, oh, you can't be here with the baby. What do you mean you can't be here with the baby? Well, the second grader can stay here and the baby can be here. The Harlem Children's Zone, we found out of it because the principal was able to call a social worker, was able to call a preventive program that was able to advocate for this mom so that we could keep the second grader connected to, yes, education, but I call it keep laying our eyes on them to make sure that they have what they need. But looking at all of those systems and saying, though, if it was, back in the day, what would have happened is somebody would have called ACS and they would have taken that child away. For our adolescents, I was thinking this summer how crazy all that was going on with George Floyd and with them seeing the racial reckoning. And they were in their houses behind closed doors trying to process this. And I was like, no, we've got to connect with them. We were able to have a town hall with our young people and to say to them, you should be, Miss Ann, we got to be out in the street protesting. So what does that look like? How do we use that as a teachable moment and as a way to educate them, right? Education just doesn't happen from 9 to 5 in the building. When you're part of the community, when you walk outside and you see them, you could say, do you have your mask on? And if you run into the cops and something goes down, this is what you need to do. This is who you need to call. I say that this comprehensive approach is what we need to do. Schools are not equipped to do all of that. I get it, you guys. But to me, if we don't really have people in the classroom that care about young people, I think about, Takiema talked about the levels of suspension. At our school, we were like, you can't just suspend a kid. Sometimes people, I want to tell you something. People have personal grudges sometimes, and they do things and take things out on children that they shouldn't. So we would have a decision-making, right? Groups so that we could say, what's going on with this young person and do they have what they need? Oftentimes, it was about what was wrong with those adults who weren't doing what they needed for those young people. When you take away the save room, when you build it, the suspension, all those places, all of a sudden, all the kids are there. If you don't even allow that to be what you're thinking about, it doesn't happen. To me, the reason that it's so important to think about systemic issues is because all of the good work that we were able to do at the Harlem Children's Zone didn't change the world that was taking these young people afterwards, the world that they had to face. And if we didn't explain to them, there is nothing wrong with you. There has never been anything wrong with you. I want to have a conversation with you guys about segregation, because I actually don't think segregation is the problem. There's nothing wrong with Black kids being together. It's what people then think about those Black kids together, the resources they don't get, what we think about their Black parents, their angry moms, and all of this other kind of stuff. How do we change that so that they can flourish? And Takiema, I just want to thank you. I'm going to wrap up. I don't think I'm going to ever use the phrase achievement gap again, because I think that you're right. It is the underpinnings of that is really racist. It's like once you are able to be more white, once you are able to achieve this, then you're good. I think COVID has taught us a lot, but what I already knew was that safety net was not appropriate, wasn't right. And I agree with you three. I don't think that it should just be about going back to the way things were, because the way things were not working for Black and brown children in this city. And that is the honest truth.
Wow, thank you. Thank you all. So I want to just move us into some questions, which I believe you all ended to allow me to say, then what happens next? Where do we go from here? Are there promising policies and practices and solutions that you think need to be put forth? And let's leave cost aside. Takiema, I don't know if you want to start and others jump in.
Yeah, I'm like, we don't need to leave cost aside. There's enough money. Like we have to really stop acting like there's not enough resources to make this society equitable, because there are, if we make the choice to do that, right? We make a lot of choices with our money. And so, so I totally reject that money is a barrier, because it isn't.
And I love the way that they always tell Black and brown people, oh, we've got to cut the budget. We've got to cut, we've got to do that. And that's just a lie. And so we should reject that and say, we're not, that doesn't make any sense and we don't believe it.
Yeah. I mean, that's really a big piece of it, right? I mean, there's so many things that are working. I mean, on a micro level, I was just gonna, refer to some of the practices that were happening in educational spaces that were very positive, like this focus on SEL and restorative practices. Morningside Center for Teaching Social Responsibility, that's a link that I think will go into the chat as well, has all these lessons from K to 12 on how to talk to children about white supremacy, how to talk to children about Breonna Taylor, and doing it in a way that is very supportive and recognizing the trauma that, that we are carrying, again, and to be clear, not because we are Black or not because we are of color or not because students are LGBTQ, it's because of the systemic, personal and interpersonal and systemic and institutional oppression that people experience because of their identity. So I think, on a local level, there's lots of things happening. And I also want to just amplify this idea of parent power.
Don't forget to talk about the healing engaged strategy, because when we focus on trauma, I feel like now everybody's like trauma, and focused on the pathology of that. And actually it's not just that, but there are ways to deal with young people that's more about healing. And I know you are an expert in that.
No, I'm not. No. I don't believe in experts. We're all learning, all learning and growing. But let me just bring up parents, right? Because I think this idea, another thing that I want to complicate is the idea that because children are not in schools formally, right, and having struggles with the remote, that they have nothing and everything is awful. Because if we're going to look at the facts, there was a lot that has been awful for children in schools, right, based on identity. That's just reality. And so what we have now is this opportunity for us, for everyone who works with children in some way, to say, how have we been really engaging with parents? How have we been actually recognizing the strengths that they bring to their experiences of parenting and living and surviving and thriving in a racist, oppressive society? There are lots of wonderful things that are happening. And there's a liberation school that's happening that the Center for Educational Justice has just put out, which is based on the Freedom Schools. I'm in a group on Facebook with 3,000 BIPOC parents and caregivers that have chosen to either pull their kids out of the formal educational system or remain, but do self-directed learning with their children. And if you see what is happening in there, we're talking about single moms, low-income families, grandparents that are caregiving. There's a lot happening, but we just have to think about, are we going to open our eyes and recognize that we have been socialized in our field, right, in education and human services, to look at success or to look at achievement through a white supremacist lens, so that we don't even value what other people are bringing and the healing that families are bringing to their children in this space as we mourn and grieve and struggle together in this space. I'll stop because I talk a lot.
Yeah, I'd like to say a couple of things about what I think we could do also. I had mentioned earlier the struggle that I have with the word inclusion, because that word in and of itself asserts that there's a power dynamic. To be included means that you need an invitation, or you're waiting for someone to say, please join us, or you're the person in power to say, you know what, I think we should include the following people. I think we need to really turn that word on its head a little bit and maybe replace it with representation. And I think that is a much more appropriate word when you're talking about school systems, healthcare systems, any kind of systems that involve participants, a workforce, and people who have to make decisions. A lot of chatter has come around, having a seat at the table, but also recognizing that there's multiple tables and different people need to be parts of different conversations at different times. And that is representation. That's not just inclusion. The other thing that I think that whenever we have a crisis in the country or locally, it's always a time and an opportunity to rebuild. The early childhood system transitioned from Agency of Children's Services to the Department of Education. So the past couple of years have been years of transition, of having new oversight, new contracts, so on and so forth. But it's an opportunity to really look at the infrastructure of what's happening. Early childhood cannot just be tagged on to the K-12 system. Early childhood is a different set of disciplines that really have to focus on child development, language development, social emotional development, physical development. The foundation of education lays in early childhood. So if your foundation, think of a house, if the foundation is cracked or stressed or doesn't get the proper attention that it needs, everything that is built on top of that is weak and compromised. So early childhood education, not just because that is my field, but the importance of knowing that so many developmental milestones have to be supported and nurtured before the children turn 5, and then strengthened to 2nd grade. If those things don't happen with intentionality and support and resources and money that we do have, I agree with you, Takiema, then everything else that happens after that is sitting on this shaky foundation. So shore up the foundation, have real conversations of not how to add on early childhood, but how to really start with early childhood and build a continuum of birth through high school, so that we're not supporting and perpetuating the preschool to prison pipeline, so that we're really rethinking what education can be and not do business as usual. We're not in a normal time. We shouldn't be thinking about benchmarks and assessments and teacher evaluations. We need to make sure that our children who are already whole get the resources they need to stay whole. You're not talking about equity in terms of taking people who are less than. People have what they have, and they're already whole. What is not whole are the resources and access to the systems, to the education, to the opportunity. So bring these whole people into a place where they can get everything that they need.
It's so, every time I listen to you guys, I feel like we're learning. So I want to go back to this concept of inclusion, Michelle, because I think that language is so important, because I know that the phrase that really gets me is parent engagement. And I used to tell my staff, I don't understand. They are the parents. They are already engaged. It's us that needs to.
Right. We have to. Right.
Right. I'm like, they are 100% parents. They are 100% present. And Takiema, during when we first went to remote, there was like 90% attendance. And I was like, that's about the parents in the household being like, boy, you better get on the computer and you better get your stuff. And I said, so can this whole thing about lack of parent engagement, can we finally put that to the side? And now you guys can see that parents are really engaged. And I think in the public school system, there's such an anti-parent sentiment. I'm just going to say it. And that they want compliance from parents. They want parents to be, seen and not heard. You want them to stay outside of the school door. And I just don't think that that's how real whole education happens. I don't think that you can educate kids or love kids and disrespect and and not like their parents. And so what would that look like to really open up and do something with the community, with parents, in order to say what education should look like? And I just think it's something that's an underpinning of the work that I think a comprehensive community-based school and approach really does.
And I totally agree with you. And it's not your opinion that students can't fully learn if their parents aren't respected and their cultures aren't engaged. It's actually fact. Zaretta Hammond has written Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, and she talks about neuroscience, right? The neuroscientific basis of having your culture and your way of understanding the world. I'm not talking about the food you eat necessarily, or the holidays that you celebrate, but the deep culture, the values that guide you, that allow you to process the world culturally. If those things aren't supported in your educational experience, there is an absolute limit to what you can actually learn. You can comply in some cases, and in some cases you don't. And parents are, if they're not a part of that, or children are educated within the context of their cultures, their histories, their communities, and their families. And so we have to, it's not an opinion. Like, we are not providing full, high scale, high quality education in this moment until we get clear on that.
And then we look at the test scores and we're like, oh, something must be wrong with those kids and that community. And to your point, Michelle, I think you made a point when we were doing our prep, which is like, people don't even understand what should be happening at your age group, because to think that little ones are not going to socialize, that they're going to sit in a chair, that we're going to give them a piece of paper and they're going to talk to a screen, is not how little ones learn. They're not engaged in their work, which is play, all of these things that people don't understand, which they wouldn't do for their own kids, but somehow that's what they think should be happening now for kids that look like us.
So
Exactly.
There's a question, can I just jump in? There's a question
Sure.
in the chat. Somebody wanted to know, how do we transition from a policy of compliance to parent and community participation? Which I think this is where the conversation was going.
Yeah, I think that we have to convince the decision makers to think differently. Compliance is tied to funding, and funding is tied to compliance. So we have to have a comprehensive conversation of what it means to really have meaningful and whole experiences for children and families that are not just tied to compliance. If you do things that support child development, the compliance will fall into place. The compliance will fall into place. If you have environments that are safe, nurturing, you have qualified staff, you have leeway to make decisions, you have a true partnership with the community and parents, and not vice versa. If you really invest in that dynamic, then the compliance will fall into place. Test scores will go up, children engagement will go up, participation will go up, enrollment, attendance will go up, because if children feel comfortable and are excited or invigorated about going to school and don't have to worry about being frisked at metal detectors, and don't have to worry about the parent who's running late because they're doing all of these other things. People want to feel welcome in a space. And in order to do that, you have to have everybody on the same page. The compliance will fall into place if we do what we're supposed to do on the front end.
And Susan, for me, I'm like, they're the parents, they're in charge, we're in service to them. I don't understand how it got flipped. All I know is that in middle class communities, people send an email or a text and the teacher and the head of school better, respond, and they get that. So why all of a sudden in a public school setting, if it's a Black parent, if she comes up to the school, people are gonna be like, do you have a meeting? No, I don't have a meeting. My kid is in that school, so I wanna talk to you. So I feel like I wanna stop begging people to give people the rights that they have, because those are their children. So the word compliance to me is BS. And in terms of compliance, meaning, Michelle, how we want parents to act, and that we need to hand it over. The community and the parents are in the driver's seat. They just need to know that more and push it more. And I think those of us, more policymakers who are educators and who are from the community, need to be around the table so that those policies can come into place.
And then the system also needs to give the stakeholders the opportunity to practice that dynamic, Anne, right? So if you think about early childhood and how many are in community-based organizations and are, part of this whole system and want to do certain things to build that bridge, to switch the power dynamic, to have more of a partnership, to be responsive to parents, but there is a level of compliance for agencies, right? Because it's like, yes, I know that this may be the right thing, or we should push this agenda.
Right.
And community-based organizations are often caught between a rock and a hard place of doing what they know is conducive to the development and support of the children and being held responsible to a compliance checkpoint. So
Takiema, did you want to
the compliance matrix is all over the place.
Yeah. I wanted to just jump in. I think, all the points that you're bringing up is really that it's so layered, right? And there's no one solution, right? We're not going to just figure out how to address all of this. I want to just share this one last slide, because I think really what we're talking about is really, this is the root of it, right? We have to really get clear that all of these issues, every single issue that we have brought up this morning has its roots in systemic racism, more specifically in anti-Black racism, which impacts everyone, white supremacy, and also patriarchy, right? So that's at the root of all of this. That's the why people can have differential experiences as parents walking into a school, or there can be different levels of compliance and expectations based on the racial and class makeup of a school or community-based organization. That's really what it is. And so we know that systemic racism, anti-Black racism, white supremacy, and patriarchy operate on multiple levels, personal, institutional, right? Those become systems, right? So we're operating on all of them all the time. And so my question is, what is everyone's ongoing comprehensive plan to address these massive things that are guiding every step we take in our personal lives, in our professional roles, the institutions that we lead, and the systems? Everybody has to have an ongoing and comprehensive plan to say, I've got to unpack this, I've got to disrupt this, I've got to stop participating in anti-Black policies, or I've got to stop, centering white family dynamics, right? But you have to know what that is, and you have to have a plan, right? And in organizations and in systems in New York City, what's the plan? I remember Department of Health had a plan that was doing anti-racism, and I think they're still doing it. And I'm like, this is amazing. I've seen some of the work, but it takes a long time, right? We've had systemic racism for over 500 years. So it's gonna take time, it's ongoing, it's never gonna stop. And so I just wanna really point out also this idea of the plan is not for just some people to be a part of it or to be leading it, it's for everyone. And do we even need a table, right? There can be multiple tables, there might not be a table that's even needed, but it cannot be about inviting people in. It has to be about standing around and saying, we've been having a conversation and creating and participating in an educational system that has literally oppressed people that don't have power over and over and over again. We cannot settle for that anymore, because we will continue to get what we had, and it will be worse as we move forward, as we already know, because we didn't even look at the stats of the death rates and the sickness and COVID rates of Black and Latino families and children from the multi-system inflammatory system. Predominantly were Black and Latino who died in the spring in this city. And so the other thing is like the silos, right? We cannot have one person over here, one person over there. Oh, there's your social worker, there's your teacher, there's your principal. Everyone's having different conversations. There's your community-based org doing pre-K over there, and then there's pre-K in public school. It's never gonna work if we don't all get together and start talking and create a plan and know that this is work that is gonna be for the rest of our lives if we hope to see change.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the opportunities New Yorkers will have in the next 8 months is an opportunity to see a parade of candidates running for mayor on down and on out. And so what do we need to think about as we look at what candidates are saying or talking about? What would we advise our city's leaders to do as they need to start talking about racial equity and the issues around education that we raised this morning?
So one of the things that jumps out is the conversation that we've been having since March about this digital divide. It's been such a critical point of success, quote unquote, of children being engaged in schools. And the response was to distribute tablets and distribute laptops. But that's a Band-Aid because there's communities that don't have the Wi-Fi technology to even use these instruments. So, when you're talking about digital divide, let's have a real conversation about getting neighborhoods who are not up to speed, literally and figuratively, with proper technology. You know, people shouldn't have to take their tablet and go to another neighborhood and sit outside of buildings to get Wi-Fi connection. So handing out tablets and handing out laptops was a couple of steps out of order. You know, get the infrastructure established and set so that when you do give out tools, children can use them. The other thing is really looking at our funding stream for education is very segregated at also, and it's reflected in how early childhood is kind of dispersed throughout the communities. So trying to figure out how do you blend and cost allocate childcare block grant money, federal, state, local funding, foundation money. How do you blend all of that so that you're not turning children away from different opportunities based on their income? Because that's what's essentially happening right now. So those are the two things that I would say. I have many more, but those are the two things that jump, access to technology and really figuring out how to fund this so that you're not denying any child any kind of opportunity based on their income.
Sue, you know what I was thinking about? One of the things that the de Blasio administration had an idea about, but it wasn't implemented, was this concept of a children's cabinet, so that you would actually have agencies and nonprofit and community folks together really focused on how much money is being poured into communities for children serving activities, and is there a way to streamline that? It goes back to Michelle's point about how the budget is so siloed and how some things are just working against each other. So I would want the mayor to think about, what is that common view? We know that we are actually spending a lot of money in communities, but how are we spending that in the way that communities need? How would we look at schools? When we talk about defunding the police, you know that we, FPWA did a session a couple of weeks ago where they were like, defund them and give the money to nonprofits. And we had a conversation the other day, many nonprofits haven't done their anti-racist work either. So we just don't want to go back to giving it to money to places that are not doing the work that Takiema talked about in order to really sort of unpack, dismantle white supremacy that are in those organizations. So for me, a kind of a getting on the balcony and looking at all of those agencies, all of the money that's coming into communities, and coming up with plans that are community driven, parent driven, to really come up with some of that money that they don't think that they have, in order to really agree about what outcomes we think really look for children and family well-being.
Can I want to make one other point. I'd be remiss if I leave this out, because it's been such an important part of the work that we've been doing in the city is if anybody who is running for office, we really need to look at the workforce and compensate them commiserate to the work and credentials and everything. Early childhood is underfunded and the workforce is undercompensated for their work. So really doing a real deep dive on not just salary parity, but appropriate, reasonable, and respectful compensation for everyone who's working in the field.
Absolutely. So I'm going to tell you what I'm looking for in a mayor, and I'm already working candidates. So I have been talking to people, and I plan to be communicating very clearly and vocally and loudly with them about what I want in a mayor. So number one, I want every single city agency to have a clearly laid out comprehensive racial equity plan with adequate funding. I want to know what the long, medium, and short-term goals are of this racial equity plan. To your point, Anne, you can move money around, you can start new initiatives. I want people doing the work. This is my life at stake, my child's life, my children's children, my community. This is everyone, my city that my family has been here since 1918, right? This is really, really important to me. So I really want to see the work happening. And that work is going to focus on fixing the agencies, fixing the policies and the practices, not looking at the so-called deficits of the communities, right? That's really, really important. So lots of funding. When it comes to schools, the city, the next mayor really has to make sure that the talk matches the walk, right? We cannot have full racial equity and to reduce segregation and to give kids everything they need and have screens for getting into middle schools and high schools in some districts to have mayoral control and to have high stakes tests. There are children right now, today, sitting in front of computer screens being tested at 5 and 6 and 7 years old. What are you testing them for? It's a pandemic. Okay. First, second of all, I can already tell you what the numbers are going to say because we already know that high stakes tests are racist. Ibram Kendi released a letter yesterday to the Boston Public School Board about the racist nature of high stakes tests and all of the segregation that it encourages and entrenches. And so we cannot have one hand saying one thing. We want desegregated schools and then continue to implement policies that back that up and entrench it even further. We have got to get together, break down the barriers and be consistent and fund it. That's what we need to do. That's one thing I'm looking for when it comes to schools. And really, for sure, the parent engagement thing is real. Like, Anne, I love your reframing. Like, they're the parents, we're the guests. We have been invited to support them in learning and education, because education does not only happen inside of school buildings, we know that. And so what are we doing to really support parents? Look at the school leadership teams, look at the parent teacher associate, like what is the power that is really given for policy, right? The PEP, I stayed on that meeting until 3:26 in the morning trying to testify as a parent in August. That was a lot. Right. But there were 200 parents there. How are their voices being heard? How are we having impact in policy, right? So these are some of the things that I'm looking for.
Right, yeah.
Thank you. Unfortunately, this was not a 3-hour panel because I think we could have easily gone. Can we just, and I'd like to afford you a whole juicy 60-second wrap up each to just leave us with a final thought. And I also want to thank everybody who is watching this morning. We are actually taking all of these suggestions down. This program is being recorded. And so we promise not to lose any of these great suggestions and ideas as we move forward. So thank you so much. So let's see if we can do a little quick wrap up, and let's go backwards, and I'll start with Anne this time.
My quick wrap up is thank you for being and introducing me to these fierce women who I will keep in contact with. So thank you, ladies.
Yes.
I am worried about the kids. And I'm worried about all that they have gone through over this summer, what they have seen. I'm worried about this political environment that they're in. I know I'm overstimulated, so I know they're overstimulated. And so when we talk about social and emotional learning and when we get whatever that new normal looks like, I'm anxious about how people are going to want them to sit down and be quiet and not talk about stuff and not express themselves. And so that is what I'm going to leave you with right now, that I'm really worried about the kids, and I'm hoping that we can, again, not go back to normal, but use this opportunity to come up with something bold and different so that they can heal, so that they can grow, and so that they can thrive.
Thank you. Michelle.
Thank you again for having me. Just to wrap up, I want us to rethink the idea of waiting to be included. I want us to shift that conversation and think about, how do you want to represent yourself and who do you want representing you when you can't be the voice? In 2 days, New York is starting their early voter campaign. I mean, the early voting starts on Saturday. So if you are not sure where to vote, please look it up. Go to voter, look up elections.newyork.gov, and be involved, because you have to be represented and you have to represent yourself as parents and community members. And the last thing is, I want to thank my early childhood community for just doing some really amazing work, always, but especially during the pandemic. My university settlement team is amazing, and the teachers, the cooks, the program directors, custodians, family workers, parents and children, we're all trying to get through and figure this thing out together. And I wouldn't be able to be on this call if it wasn't for my team. So I just want to thank University Settlement's Early Childhood Division, but all the early childhood education folks in New York. Thank you for the work that you're doing.
Takiema?
I'm just thinking about this saying that is very popular that has just been really resonating with me, particularly now. And it's that until all of us are free, none of us are.
That's right.
Right. And I just think about the fact that things in the city are working really well for some people, right? Things in education across the country, things in, right? The billionaires did great. Amazon did great. Like things are working really well, but they should not be comfortable. No one should be comfortable just because you might be okay. Going back to the beginning, this is not about a handout or feeling sorry for people and saying, oh my goodness, look what you've endured, you know, as people with oppressed identities. That's not what this is about. This is about what is absolutely everyone's right, our unalienable right to achieve our highest potential in a society that claims, right, that was founded on this notion that, you know, the free and, you know, everyone can achieve and the dream and all of that, which we know has always been elusive for so many. And so my thing is we all need to be activists. We all need to say, what is my part? What is my space that I'm going to work in to create greater equity for all? Because that's what it means to be living in community. And truthfully, children, I believe, are going to be the ones that lead us. Millennials and Generation Z are incredible. Don't believe the hype, because they're the ones that have pushed us farther in the last few years than all of us older folks thinking we have to just keep working incrementally. Right now we're using the word abolish, right? And that is a real thing. And so I think I want to look to the younger people. I want to look to the children, right? Because they believe what we tell them. They believe what we create for them. And they also just come in with their own light. There's this little boy that says these affirmations that I saw. This little video was just the cutest thing. And he's like, I am smart, I am beautiful, I can achieve. And I'm like, baby, my work is to make sure that that actually happens. And that's what everyone's work should be.
Thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate Takiema and Michelle for being with us today. This was a first conversation, clearly not a last conversation. I want to thank my partners at the Citizens Committee for Children, the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, for having these real and difficult conversations, which we believe will bring us to a stronger, more inclusive city. Please, for those of you who are watching, don't forget to share your feedback with us in a survey that could be accessed through a link found in the chat. And next week is a final conversation on justice equity. Again, thank you all and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michelle and Anne. It's great to talk with you again.
All right.
Thanks,
This was
everyone.
great.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you,
Thank you,
TJ. And thank you, our closed captioner. Thank you so much for accessibility, Joshua.
Amen.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good morning.
All right.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.